Our two guests followed, observed, and participated in the events in the region, but also followed European politics and transatlantic relations and witnessed many major events and processes of the contemporary world. I will now move to the first part of today's panel with a question to both panelists on the legacy of the 1990s, a topic they have both written about. In your opinion, as persons who witnessed the events, discussed them with relevant regional and international actors, wrote about them, and organized conferences about the region in the 1990s, what is the legacy of those years now in the region? Ivan, maybe start with you.
Thank you very much, Slobodan. Congratulations on the 30th anniversary of BOŠ, and it's very moving to be reminded of the whole history and of the events that you portrayed. And of course, I remember very well that day when bombs were falling and we were talking about EU integration to the students of the Belgrade Open School in June 1999. And of course, remembering Miša's call that suddenly came at the end of the lecture asking, how is it, how are you surviving, you know, and what's the outlook as a dear friend. And I must say, I've known Miša thanks to Sonja Licht, who introduced me to Miša, I think in 1989 or 1990, I can't remember the exact year. So we've been around together, all of us, and it's really very moving also to have seen a lot of friends and colleagues coming to this event, and it makes it even more exceptional to have all of you here in the room. So without taking too long, I'll mention some of the key things. We always must go back to 1989 and the fall of the wall, which many countries understood was a turning point. The fall of communism, when countries in Eastern Europe claimed and wanted to return to Europe, as they were saying. And that same moment, Yugoslavia, that had relations with the European Union, or rather the European community, since I think the end of the 70s, and that seemed like the most likely and first candidate to join the community, later the Union, in fact took a dramatic and catastrophic turn that was exceptional to all other countries. We were the proverbial car driving in the wrong direction on the highway. As the saying goes, as there was a return to the end of history, but as Miša Gleni rightly put, there was rebirth of history happening in the worst way in this country. And that's, I think, one of the strongest memories. It was the end of three communist federations, the Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, that happened in the worst way. It was the Milosevic 90s that left a catastrophic legacy of a criminalized society and a criminalized state, but it was also a time of hope, because there was a birth of civil society, there were the protests against the war, endless demonstrations since the early 90s, since the first attack on Dubrovnik by the Yugoslav People's Army, the strikes at the University of Belgrade, jumping over many events, the victory of the opposition in the local elections in 1996, the days and days of protests all over Serbia, and the victory in 55% of cities of Serbia that was a springboard towards the elections of 24 September 2000 and then 5th of October that we marked just a few days ago here in Belgrade. And I think that is something that we will always remember in these very bad and very good ways. And without taking too much longer, I cannot not mention, Slobodan, that this here place is where the tribuna, the panels of Druga Srbija took place in 92, 93, and people who come to mind who are no longer with us, like Stojan Cerovic or Vladimir Dimitrijevic, Trent or Ivica Mimica, we're here to propose, and allow me just to say that Druga Srbija, which is so maligned among nationalistic circles, is nothing else than a democratic European Serbia. The struggles of the 90s were to instigate the rule of law, an open society that would become part of the European family while retaining the cultural, historical, religious and other particularities of other societies. That's what the other Serbia was about, and I still think we're in the same business.
So, Miša, what do you say, the legacy of the 1990s as a writer of history of the Balkans?
First of all, dobro večer svima. It's great to be back in Belgrade. I'm not here often enough, but thank you very much for the invitation to thank you to the Belgrade Open School, and it's a real pleasure to be on the stage here with Ivan, and also I'm thrilled that Sonja Licht is in the audience as well, because most of what I've learned about this country and the region comes from the two of them. So blame them if I say anything stupid. This is I mean, Ivan was extremely economical, I thought, with his answer, and did a very good job. But the issue of the legacy is a very complicated question. I'd like to pick up on one thing that he said about Yugoslavia being in a good position as we move towards 1989, or possibly being considered for having a closer relationship with the European Union. I think it's worth remembering that Yugoslavia, the Communist Federation of Yugoslavia, was not an ideal, or the Federated Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia was not an ideal state. There was a lot of secret police activity, but when you came from somewhere like Czechoslovakia or East Germany or, God forbid, Romania or Albania, there was a real breath of fresh air when you got to Yugoslavia. You felt as though there was genuine debate, a genuinely spontaneous culture which sometimes aroused the wrath of the party and cultural, leading cultural politicians. But on the whole, it was a really exciting place to be. Romania and Bulgaria were regarded in Yugoslavia as rather poor cousins, and one thing that Yugoslavs were often able to comfort themselves with is that they weren't Romania or Bulgaria. And so when you see the process from the late 80s to 2007, when Romania and Bulgaria became members of the European Union, it was a big wake-up call for everybody, particularly here in Serbia, to see that Romania, of all places, had joined the European Union. And that gave, I think, to an extent, that gave the former Yugoslavia, the constituent parts of it, a chance to reflect on what had gone wrong. I think it's also important to remember that at the time that Yugoslavia was beginning to feel the strains and stresses of the end of communism and its dissolution into violence, there was a comparable situation in Transylvania. You had a very similar group emerge amongst the Romanians, called Vatra Romanesca, and you had some very unreasonable nationalist voices coming out of parts of Hungary, and there were violent incidents, and people were killed and people were injured, and that process was stopped by a political process that began in Budapest and Bucharest where basically the two leaderships and the elites of the countries got together and said, actually, we don't want this to happen. Let us implement some measures which are going to prevent the inflammation of nationalist passions. And here in the former Yugoslavia, what happened is the leaderships, first in Serbia and then in quick succession of Croatia, decided that that was not a path that they were going to go down, but it was a conscious decision. And you then saw the beginning of a process whereby the state itself and heads of state deemed and projected through the media that it was permissible to take the life of other people. And the spiral began. It began really, I would say, in May and June 1991 with the massacres in Croatia, and then after that it just went downhill. Now, I and others tried to counter the narrative that was happening at the time during the wars, that this was about ancient ethnic hatreds, because that simply didn't stand up to scrutiny. Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Albanians, Macedonians, Slovenes have all got on tolerably well in various parts of their history. So what was really going on here? For me, what this was about was the dissolution of a state, and its assets were up for grabs. And you saw leaders use the nationalist narrative in order to grab hold of state assets and privatize them. And they mobilized organized crime in order to do that. They mobilized corrupt networks. They mobilized the intelligence services. And this is where I want to come to the legacy, which is not exclusive to the former Yugoslavia, but it's made everything much more complicated in the former Yugoslavia than it has, say, in countries like Romania or Bulgaria. And that is it is very easy and very quick for a culture of corruption and criminality to put down deep roots in a society. It's then extremely difficult to pull out those roots and to try and steer a society back towards some form of normality. And this issue, which affected the former Soviet Union, which affected all of the former communist states, is one which none have successfully overcome, but some countries are battling with it more successfully than others. And really that, for me, is the primary legacy and difficulty of these territories, encapsulated in one event, and that was the assassination in March 2003 of Zoran Đinđić. Zoran Đinđić was, to my mind, attempting to drag Serbia out of the 20th century into the 21st century in a very short space of time. And the conspiracy which was responsible for his murder were all the usual suspects of those who had made huge sums of money and reveled in the violence of the 1990s. And it's something that this country and other countries in the region is still struggling to overcome.
So with this legacy of corruption, organized crime, political assassination, we come to the perceptions of the region that the events of the 1990s and of 2003 made about Serbia and the region in Western Europe. So these perceptions, do they still operate as a potential hindrance to faster enlargement, in your opinion?
Well, another big question. The simple answer is yes, but what one has to remember first of all is that when the wars ended here, By this time, diplomats, journalists, the general public, business people were fed up with those, I'm talking about people from outside the region, obviously it was axiomatic that inside the region everyone was fed up, but outside the region were fed up with the constant flow of bad news out of southeastern Europe, and everyone was hugely relieved. Well, first when Dayton came along, and then when 1244 brought the Kosovo War to, well, armistice, and then to a sort of a conclusion. And interestingly enough, even when things threatened to explode in Macedonia fairly soon after this, there was not much interest in the media at the time. So what happens is that Western interest in particular basically emigrated out of southeastern Europe, and 2001 happened, and so September 2001 with the downing of the Twin Towers, and so everyone's perception of what was a threat to the world changed, and all of a sudden individual terrorism became the #1 problem. Now, in the meanwhile, the societies here in southeastern Europe were stewing in the residual juices of war and social collapse. And although there was a certain engagement on the part of the European Union, culminating in 2003 in the Salonika Declaration of promising European Union membership, certainly all media organizations pulled out of the former Yugoslavia, weren't interested, and there were a huge number of post-conflict problems facing this area, not the least of which was the constitutional ambiguity, because there were a whole series of constitutional resolutions to the conflict here, varying from territory to territory based on different principles, interestingly enough. And so there was little attention paid to the real challenges that this region faced after the conflict. And on one level I understand that, because I'm a journalist, one tends to follow where the events are happening. But there was a huge sigh of relief, and I think that translated itself into real neglect of the region, and we're still suffering from that at the moment. On balance, it was a good thing that Croatia made it into the European Union just as the doors were closing, although I always maintain that for the stability of the region, having Serbia and Croatia in the European Union would be a much more optimal solution, because it balances the tension in the region. And after Serbia, were Serbia to become a member, I think that Bosnia would follow fairly quickly.